the war is at a turning point now. If you follow the war very closely, the situation on the battlefronts is trending more and more to Russia's favor. But they are still interested, I think, in a negotiated solution because they want to settle in the long term their relations with Europe. Now, if we leave it too long, we might that window of opportunity might close. But we could actually be, if we sought peace now, closer to achieving peace than we have ever been at any time since the conflict began in 2014. We have a choice between peace and war, and that choice remains open, I think, for the rest of the year, but not for much longer.
Hello everybody, my name is Buitink and welcome to the Reinvent Money podcast, where I discuss money and geopolitics with experts across the world. Today my guest is Alexander Mercouris. He is editor-in-chief of the podcast Duran. Hi Alexander, welcome.
I'm delighted to be here, Paul.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the Ukraine, of course, and the awful war that's been going on there now for over 2 years. We're going to talk about how to achieve peace and what's going on right now across the world in order to achieve that. First of all, there was this big NATO summit this week in Washington to celebrate 75 years of NATO. And Biden said NATO was at its strongest ever. In the summit declaration, China was blamed for its no-limits partnership with Russia. It also said, quote, the deepening strategic partnership between Russia and China and their mutually reinforcing attempts to undercut and reshape the rules-based international order are cause for profound concern, unquote. And China, of course, responded strongly, saying that the US should reflect on the root cause of this crisis. So what's your take on this summit?
Well, it was a very angry summit, at least if you judge by the communique. The language of the communique is incredibly shrill. And, it has a whole list of transgressions that Russia has committed or alleged to have committed, which perhaps isn't surprising. I mean, there is a war. There's a conflict in Ukraine. Europeans and Americans and Russians have taken different sides. But then there's an equally long list of transgressions that the Chinese are supposed to have committed. There's incredibly strong language about the Chinese. And to the extent that we're talking about preserving the rules-based international order and, criticizing the Chinese for working with the Russians to, undermine it, I think the NATO powers perhaps need to ask themselves a question of, firstly, what the rules-based international order is and why a country like China might be unhappy with it, and whether really it makes much sense to address China itself in this kind of way. And if you're going to criticize China for getting too close to Russia, why not criticize India in the same terms, and Saudi Arabia and all sorts of other countries? Because it's quite clear that most countries around the world, I think that's a fair assessment, don't agree with the language and tone of the NATO communique. And of course, if NATO is a military alliance, why is it talking in this way either? I mean, isn't this going way beyond its original remits, its previous geographical limits, all kinds of things of this kind? So lots of questions. But the other thing to say is an angry communique, a rather, I thought, grandiose communique in which, sort of treating all the world, as little children, that you can tick off, the teacher ticks off. But of course, lots of underlying problems. I mean, questions about the President of the United States, questions about the situation in France, a new prime minister in Britain who's finding his way and hasn't yet fully done so. And I don't think NATO is stronger than it has ever been. I think, to me, it looks overextended And at the moment, its leadership is fragile.
And do you think it will change anything? This statement or this summit, is China going to change the way it deals with Russia? Are they going to, for example, export less to China or to Russia as a result of this statement and this summit?
No, I don't think it is, because I think the Chinese see this as a challenge, and the language that the communique uses about China, which goes beyond China's relationship with Russia, clearly signals to the Chinese that they're now in NATO's crosswires. So that is going to make them look for friends and allies, and Russia is going to be one. So on the contrary, it's going to consolidate the relationship between China and Russia. If you want to create problems between these two countries, if you want to draw them apart from each other, you would not address China in this way. It's completely misconceived. You would develop a completely different relationship with China and make the Chinese feel that they have a stake in the system that you have, or at least a relationship that you have. And then they might not feel so concerned to maintain and preserve a relationship with Russia. But as it is, the Chinese feel that they're being pushed into a corner, and they're going to, as I said, look for friends.
Yeah, so it's going to have the opposite effect then in the end.
Yes, that's exactly what it's going to do. And again, if NATO leaders were perhaps a little more reflective, they would see this.
Yeah, and on the other hand, we have Orban doing his world peace tour. First going to Kiev, then to Moscow, Beijing, and now he's meeting with Trump. I think yesterday. But Hungary at the same time is also a NATO member. I guess they also signed this summit statement. But at the same time, they're playing both sides in a way.
Yes, indeed, as did Slovakia, as did Turkey. Slovakia, Hungary, and Turkey both attended the Swiss Peace Conference that took place a few weeks ago. They signed the communique there, but they're going out of their way afterwards to make it absolutely clear that they don't agree with the communique. So it brings together everybody. Everybody signs these statements, but powers within the NATO bloc quite obviously don't agree with the communiques that they are signing. Now, Hungary is a small country. Slovakia too. Turkey is, of course, a bigger country and perhaps becoming increasingly detached in many respects from the NATO alliance altogether. But again, if your concern is bloc discipline, you ought to be concerned about this. And you might be asking to yourself, what exactly is it about our policies, and perhaps even more than our policies, the language we use in these communiques, which is very shrill, which is in effect driving people away and making them play, as you absolutely rightly say, a double game where they both sign the communiques and then take steps which contradict them.
Yeah. And I'm puzzled by. I understand why, but it sort of upsets me that we have Orban, and you can disagree with him on many policies, but at least he is. And maybe I'm being naive, but at least he's trying to achieve something by talking to all sides. I mean, it's diplomacy, how it used to be back in the day. Yet he's being criticized, and they're even thinking of penalizing Hungary, taking away voting rights and everything, because he is doing this tour. And most people in Europe want peace, and they want at least efforts being undertaken to achieve some sort of peace, to broker that. Yet Orban's trying, and he's being criticized by Brussels. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that's entirely right. I mean, there's much that Orban does which makes me uncomfortable. But when it comes to diplomacy and foreign policy, he's obviously acting in the rational way. I mean, the other paradox of this whole communique and this summit is that it doesn't seem to be at all reflective of the actual realities. Now, I think we're going to talk about those what's actually happening in Ukraine in more detail shortly. But suffice to say that the communique reaffirms that Ukraine's place is in NATO, which merely incentivizes the Russians to continue the war, just as statements from Jens Stoltenberg and others that Ukraine can only join NATO once the war is over, given that for the Russians, NATO membership for Ukraine is a red line, that is simply going to provoke them to continue fighting the war until Ukraine has been completely defeated. Now, I think Orban understands that. He also understands that this war is having a bad effect on the economies and societies of Europe. In fact, he's talked about that. And he also understands that this war carries with it an inherent risk of escalation. So, as you absolutely rightly say, he's conducting diplomacy in exactly the way that it used to be and ought to be conducted. He's conducted a mediation mission. He's gone to Ukraine and Russia. He's listened to the leaders there. He's listened to the positions that each of them are taking. He's looking to see whether any common ground might be found. And he's trying to meet the stakeholders. China, which is Russia's most important friend, to see what the Chinese think. And of course, he's also gone to the United States. He's meeting with Donald Trump, who many people expect will be the next president. And he's at least trying to promote peace. And he should not be criticized for that. But instead he is. And there's talk of stripping Hungary of its presidency of the European Council and things of this kind, which make no sense at all, and I think are detached from the realities.
And is it fair to say that real peace talks with everyone involved can only commence after Trump, for example, wins the presidential elections? Because before that time, Biden and his team are, which is also clear from the NATO summit and the declaration, are in no way able or willing to establish peace. So do we need to wait for Trump to start his term?
Well, it is an extraordinary thing to say, but quite possibly. We have two problems, firstly, with the United States at the moment. Firstly, we have a president who's clearly very distracted by the criticisms and attacks on his own position. So at this moment in time, this precise moment in time, he and his team are mainly focused on that. And besides, he will not want to show weakness at this time, whatever his personal feelings about the war and about Ukraine are. So that makes it very difficult for the United States to engage in constructive diplomacy. And as we have repeatedly seen throughout this conflict, without the United States, there cannot be peace. There cannot be a peace agreement. The only peace agreement that can succeed is one in which the Americans are involved and are to which they're signed up. But beyond the president's own problems, there is still a degree of refusal to face the realities. I read an article, I think it was in Politico quite recently, within the last few days, in which they quoted senior administration officials, and they're saying that, yes, Ukraine is in severe problems. It is being pushed back along the contact line. It is losing territory. But there is an expectation that new supplies of weapons will stabilize the situation. And until that happens, in other words, until the situation on the front lines is stabilized, it's premature to seek peace. Now, I think that is a disastrous way of thinking, because the one thing we have seen happen during this war is that every escalation that the Western powers undertake is matched and equaled and sometimes surpassed by what the Russians do. So adopting that approach is not going to result in negotiations ever taking place, because you will never be in the kind of good position that, in theory, you are seeking from which to conduct negotiations. On the contrary, it's more likely, given the actual trajectory of events on the battlefields, that the situation is going to continue to get worse rather than better. And you're going to say to yourself, well, because it's getting worse, I can't negotiate. I've got to do even more. And of course, in that way, not only is peace, the prospect of peace recedes, but the dangers grow.
Yeah, because that's a pattern we've seen over the past few years. Every time new weapon systems, more advanced weapon systems are delivered with the promise that would give Ukraine the upper hand, and then in the end we see basically Russia catching up and then overcompensating, and in the end we have only more casualties. So now the F-16s, of course, are the next thing that's going to be delivered anytime soon. Maybe they're already being delivered. I know the Netherlands is also providing F-16s. What's your view on the F-16s? Same thing. They're not going to make a difference then in the end.
Well, first of all, I should say straight away that I'm not a military person. So, I mean, assessing what the capabilities of a particular weapon system is not perhaps my strongest thing. But all of the people in the militaries that I've spoken to, and all of the former militaries that I've spoken to, and all of the people, many people who are in the militaries and who understand these weapons, who've spoken openly, they seem to all agree that these F-16s are not going to change the trajectory of the war. The Russians have a very powerful air force, a very powerful air defense system. Ukraine began the war with a significant air force, but that has been essentially destroyed. There is every reason to think that with the Russians bombing the air bases from which the F-16s are operating, and with the Russians having an overwhelming preponderance of force, the F-16s might, for a short time, make the situation seem a little better. But the consistent experience of this war, whenever a new weapon system is introduced, is that the effect wears off very quickly. And then we are back where we were when we started, except perhaps sometimes even worse.
Yeah, but that's also for the Ukrainians, it's such a pity and a shame also in a way that if the West would have provided all the systems in one go, of course you need training, you need preparation, but then perhaps the Ukrainians would have been able to fend off the Russians from the start, right? So, or do you see it differently?
Well, perhaps, except of course, this has been a conflict that has been festering for many, many years. So it's possible that if the Ukrainians had been provided with all of these weapons right from the start, that might have had a different effect. But when is the start? I mean, if all of these weapons had been provided in 2022, would they have
or 2014
or 2022, would they have been enough time to absorb them and work them up to a proper level to change the course of the battlefield? If you start introducing weapons on this scale from 2014, then of course the likelihood is that the Russians would have reacted and we would have had the war sooner. One of the things that the Russians have repeatedly complained about for several years before the war started was precisely that the Western powers were making arms deliveries to Ukraine. And it turns out they were making much more extensive arms deliveries that we knew about. And the Russians were right about that. Now, they were not on the scale of what we have seen since the conflict started, but it's entirely plausible that with the military balance in Ukraine seeming to shift against them, that the Russians would have started the war even sooner than they did when Ukraine was less prepared. It's very difficult and I think that the temptation needs to be resisted to go back and, engage in hindsight and say, well, in hindsight, we should have done this and we should have done that, because the result might have been different. Because always one needs to understand that in any situation, the other side has its own say and will respond in its own way too.
Exactly. And are there any airports available anyway? We already alluded to it earlier, but are there currently in Ukraine any airports still available to where these F-16s can take off from, or do they need to make use of foreign airports?
Well, I think the Ukrainians themselves have sort of floated the last possibility. They've said that the F-16s can't all operate at the same time from their air bases, Ukrainian air bases. So some of them might need to be stationed in air bases in NATO countries. Now, the United States almost immediately said that wasn't going to happen, that this is absolutely not the intention, because the Russians, for their part, have said that if F-16s start operating from NATO air bases, then the Russians will attack them at those air bases. Now, that may be true, it may not be true, but that is what the Russians have actually said. Now, I think the United States is not looking for that kind of escalation. But then that does bring us to the problem of which air bases are these aircraft going to operate from, because the Russians are systematically attacking the air bases. Now, you can't, I think, as I understand it, simply destroy an air base. These are huge places, there's enormous runways, there's all kinds of structures there. Runways can be repaired and repaired fast, but you would be involved in a constant game of shuffling aircraft around, moving them from place to place, trying to defend them. And there's a lot of talk of sending air defense missiles to Ukraine. And one suspects that a lot of them are going to be tied down trying to defend the air bases. So you're going to get into a situation where instead of defending Ukrainian cities and energy facilities and that kind of thing, you end up defending the very systems, the F-16s, that are supposed to be defending the actual, other places in Ukraine that you say you want to defend. And based on what we have seen before, it also seems that these air defenses, even when they are built up in scale, might not be as effective as people originally assumed they would be. The West began supplying Ukraine with air defense systems in the spring of last year on a big scale. And throughout that time, Ukraine's air defense situation has steadily got worse.
Yeah, so in the end, it will only make things worse. Then, if I understand you correctly, and then one of the most important metrics I always believe in war is the number of casualties. And I think if there's one number both sides have been lying about from day one, is the number of casualties. I remember from your program that in I think it was 2022. You attach great value to the number coming from Medusa. Medusa is a Russian independent news outlet. I think the Kremlin doesn't like Medusa.
No.
They came up with the number of 5,000 Russian casualties in the first few months or so. Even though Western media were already talking about a much higher number, they said 5,000. They recently came up with an update. And they talked about 120,000 Russian deaths so far. And they based themselves on obituaries, cemetery numbers, newspapers, public registries and everything. In the West, they keep on saying it's more than 500,000, especially coming from Western intelligence services, Ministry of Defense from Britain. But this Medusa number, you think this is a realistic number, 120,000 Russians killed so far?
Right. Can I just first of all explain that there are two completely different entities. There's Medusa, which is the Russian news site that you mentioned, which is actually, I believe, based in Latvia now. And then there has been more recently, I think it got started later in 2022, the Media Zona project. Now, the Media Zona project is a much more scientific one, conducted alongside the BBC. And they are the people who go out and start looking at obituaries and using all the the open source information to find out what the records are for Russian casualties. And I think they've been providing until now very accurate figures. Now, the actual number of Russian combat deaths that they have identified, I believe, is somewhere around 60,000. What happened recently is that they said that this is probably an underestimate, and they changed their methodology to some extent, and they increased it to 120,000. And, one can accept that. I mean, certainly they are, as far as I'm concerned, the most reliable agency out there. But Russia can absorb losses on that scale. They don't give figures for losses. The Russians do not give figures for their own losses. It is a state secret in Russia. So Mediazona is about the most reliable source that we have on the Russian, what the Russians are suffering. The Ukrainians, we have no analogous agency in the West charting Ukrainian losses in the same way. What we have are figures provided by the other side, which is the Russian Defense Ministry. Now, again, people are going to be immensely skeptical about those. They suggest Ukrainian losses in aggregate, both dead and wounded, come to around 500,000. But, we can't say for certain that those are true, and they're coming from Ukraine's enemy. What one can say definitely is large numbers of people, tens of thousands of people, are being killed. Moreover, in terms of Ukrainian losses, we can also say that the trend is going upward, and it has started to go upward significantly this year. We can say that because Ukrainian officials have, to a certain extent, said as much themselves. Without giving us exact figures, they're admitting that their losses are becoming very, very high. The point is the Russians can absorb losses. They have a population of around 150 million. Ukraine's population is very much smaller. The demographic that is bearing the weight of the losses in Ukraine is proportionately also relatively small. And the Ukrainians themselves, and if you are close to the war, Ukrainian military units, commanders are complaining now that they're suffering from a great shortage of men. You do not hear analogous complaints from the Russian side.
But that's also that's my view. I condemn the whole invasion. I think the war should have never been fought. I blame Russia for that. But at the same time, if we keep on continuing this war, then we can only conclude that many more Ukrainians will die vis-a-vis Russians. But of course, also a lot of Russian young men will never be sent home. So it's a tragedy for both sides and for the rest of the community, for Europe, for the rest of the world. So it needs to end as soon as possible. But sending more weapons, as far as I understand, and also following your analysis, is not going to lead to a solution, but only will lead to more deaths and casualties. So, what would be a viable path towards peace then?
I think that the most important thing, the nettle that must be grasped, is the question of NATO membership for Ukraine. It's very difficult for people in the West because there's been so much denial about this. It's very difficult for people in the West to understand what a hot issue this is for Russians. And I don't just mean the Russian leadership. If you speak with ordinary Russians, people who are, this is the topic that continuously comes up. For them, they feel that they were promised at the end of the Cold War that there would be no movement of NATO's military structures towards their borders. And they feel that promise was broken. And they also feel that NATO, Ukraine in NATO, would be a major threat to themselves. And this is the single thing that is consolidating Russian society to support Putin and to support the war. It is why they are prepared to go on fighting and taking casualties and having all those young men, as you rightly say, not return. Now, until and unless this issue is fully addressed and there is an acceptance that this is a Russian red line, which is not going to go away, I don't myself see how there is going to be peace. If the Russians can be persuaded that the idea of NATO membership for Ukraine has been fully and completely dropped, that it is not going to happen, and that whatever security structure is created that to involve Ukraine and to provide Ukraine itself with security does not extend to bringing Ukraine into NATO, there cannot be peace. However, if this problem, which is the source of the whole problem, is finally addressed, if the Russians are satisfied that Ukraine is not going to join NATO and that there will be no American bases in Ukraine and no ballistic missiles, which is another very, very touchy issue for the Russians, American ballistic missiles, air defense missiles, ground attack, nuclear missiles, those kind of things. If they can be absolutely sure that that will not happen, then I think the roadblock towards a serious negotiation to try to achieve peace can be found. And even on the territorial question, the Russians have shown, I think, more flexibility than is widely appreciated.
Yeah, so for example, Putin a few weeks ago, that was right before the Switzerland Peace Summit, proposed a plan for peace involving also Russia keeping the four oblasts, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson. But I suspect that's just an opening move for him, right? He just wants, would he be willing to in the end leave the occupied territories, keep Crimea, accept or make sure that Ukraine doesn't join NATO, but then when it comes to these four oblasts, show more flexibility?
Right. Well, let's actually go to what Putin in fact proposed in that speech that he made a few weeks ago, because again, I don't think it's quite understood. What he actually said was that Ukrainian troops must leave the four oblasts. He didn't say that Ukraine must recognize the four oblasts as part of Russia or give up its territorial claims to the four oblasts. He wants Ukrainian troops to withdraw. Now, I think that politically, given all that's happened, it would be very, very difficult now for the Russians to pull back today from the four oblasts. But time, if you just find a way of, freezing the conflict, beginning a dialogue, starting negotiations in 10 years, 15 years, 5 years, who knows what might be achieved. But he's not asking Ukraine to recognize the four oblasts as part of Russia. And he's not asking the West to do that either. The one thing he again made absolutely clear, if you read his speech carefully, is that Ukraine's membership of NATO is an absolute non-starter. It remains for the Russians the absolute red line.
Yeah, and I guess also what will be important is that if there will be at some point a ceasefire and a brokered peace, then in the end we need to make sure that people living in these areas are being properly treated. So perhaps we can also think about UN troops there, because if Ukraine will remove its troops, then I guess Russia also should remove troops in the end, and we need independent UN people perhaps to make sure that everyone's rights are being honored. Like for example, the Ukrainians living in those oblasts should still be able to speak Ukrainian and all those things as well. So How do you see the involvement of the UN in the end, for example?
Right. Well, if a proposal like that were made to the Russians today, they would reject it. Because as far as they're concerned, these are territories part of Russia. They would not have UN peacekeepers, they would say, on their own territory. If you start a process of negotiation, if you pull the Ukrainian troops out, and the Russians are not going to leave immediately, but if you pull the Ukrainian troops out, engage in a process of de-escalation, start winding down the scale of the Ukrainian army, which is another issue that the Russians are concerned about, start discussing some of the things that you said, rights for Ukrainian speakers in Russian territory, about which the Russians, by the way, have shown great flexibility, rights for Russian speakers on Ukrainian territory, where it must be said the Ukrainians have shown no flexibility at all, then over a process of negotiations, which could take months or years, but over that process, possibilities like the one you've just floated might start to become real. I mean, I've been involved in many negotiations in my time. I've mediated and brokered some. And what I have invariably found is that once a negotiation starts and begins to take place and happens in good faith, provided both sides actually want to agree and find a way forward which respects the core interests of each, it's surprising what sort of solutions can come up. Things which you might never have expected that they would agree to, they suddenly turn around and agree to. So the most important thing is to get negotiations going. And the most important thing is to address this issue of NATO. If we can get this issue of NATO finally off the table, then things start to become possible, which are not possible now.
Yeah, and what about the war crimes that have been committed? Of course, at the end of the Second World War, we had Nuremberg trials. The Germans were prosecuted. Of course, they led this huge loss, and the Soviets and the West were the victors, so they were able to impose, of course, those trials. But are we going to see something like that as well, do you think, in the end?
I think I myself believe that if you're going to create a sustainable peace agreement, you absolutely need to address those issues. In fact, both sides are talking about that, but of course they're doing so pointing at each other. I think here the best solution would be the South African one, which is a Peace and Reconciliation Commission, one which acknowledges that terrible things have been done, examines and finds out what they were, identifies who the perpetrators were, but does so, again, in a framework that looks to achieve reconciliation between the warring parties. And by the way, contrary to what many people think, I think at a human level, this is far from impossible. Russians and Ukrainians have had a very, very long history of interaction, mostly intensely friendly. And you get information. I was talking to somebody from Russia just yesterday about this. You get it now on the battlefronts, even as these two armies fight each other relentlessly. During the breaks in the fighting, they're sending radio messages to each other. They're communicating, they're exchanging jokes, things of this kind. So if you start this process of actually looking at war crimes, identifying who the perpetrators are in extreme cases or important cases, allocating responsibilities, putting up some agreed mechanism to achieve justice and punishment and pay compensation. And it must, and this is essential to understand, in wars, things are done by both sides. It's a fallacy to think that only one is doing them. But if you do that, then actually that in itself can also help to build the peace process, to strengthen the peace process, and to facilitate the process of reconciliation between the two nations.
Yeah, for example, with your legal background, how would you then go about this attack that happened over this week, where a children hospital in Kiev was hit? And if you look at the pictures, it does seem to be a Russian cruise missile because of the jet engine that it had at the tail. So how would you then go about something like this? Who should be tried for that?
Well, the first question is what you need to establish the facts. I mean, let's assume it was a Russian missile. Was it an intentional attack on the hospital? If it was not an intentional attack on the hospital, was it negligent? Was it an act of negligence to launch a missile in that area to try and attack another position, perhaps nearby, but recklessly disregarding the fact that there was a hospital there? Or was it that there was some technical malfunction? Or was it that the missile was diverted from its course because of air defense things? The point I'm making is that in order to establish what happened, you need a proper independent investigation. You need proper investigators going over the material, talking to both sides, going through the logs of the military units involved, finding out, speaking to the directors of the missiles, the directors of the air defense systems. Again, I have been involved in this kind of thing. I've seen how it works and how it can be done. And if you do that, you can not only find your way to the truth, because we haven't had that kind of detailed investigation, and we're not able to answer all these questions. You not only find the way to the truth, but in the process, you can decide. You actually can also find your way to deciding whether or not war crimes charges should be brought in against whom. At this moment in time, I don't think we can say that. I don't think it's possible to do this. And by the way, I mean, we talked about the attack on the children's hospital. A point which is being made extensively in Russia at this present time about that incident is that about 10 days before, there was a missile strike on Crimea where the missile exploded over a beach, and large numbers of beach goers had cluster munitions fall on them, and some children were involved again. And that incident also perhaps justifies investigation. But the Russians say, you criticize us for what happened over the hospital, but you don't criticize Ukraine for what happened over the beach. So it's not my purpose to allocate blame and justice, but just to say, as somebody who was a court official, I think that a proper process to investigate, examine, find out what happened, and then to allocate responsibility and to establish a clear chain of facts, that is the only way to find justice here. And that should be done within a bigger process that will achieve peace. In fact, it is an essential part of that process to achieve peace.
And it will be very difficult because in Holland, it's an open wound 10 years after the downing of MH17. That was, of course, a very big international investigation. And both from Russian side and American side, we didn't always get the proper cooperation. So I wonder how that will be then in the future if people are doing research in earnest and not all parties involved are going to cooperate fully. It will be difficult to establish the truth.
The way to get proper investigations going is by creating a proper framework for peace in which both sides have an interest and which is pursued in good faith. Now, what happened in 2014 with MH17 is that we were at the start of a conflict. And there were ways, I think, myself, to find a solution to that conflict even then. But they were not sought, and the Russians considered themselves to be in a conflict situation, and that meant that they were not interested in participating in any kind of negotiations, because they were certainly not going to show weakness whilst they found themselves in a conflict. And of course, the Americans felt pretty much the same way, as did the Ukrainians also, because the Ukrainians also have questions to answer over that particular incident, like why didn't they close their airspace, for example. I'm not drilling into.
It's a whole different chapter, of course.
Exactly. Today, we are in a different position. We are in a situation of outright war. And strangely enough, that has actually brought us closer to a potential resolution. And one where, through a process of ending the war and achieving peace, we might actually start to get proper answers to all of these things and proper justice provided. So that's what I would say about this. Again, the South African example is a good one. Many of the things that were finally resolved as a result of the peace and reconciliation process in South Africa, I would never have expected, as somebody who was involved in the anti-apartheid movement, I would never once have expected that I would ever see the answer to, and yet it came.
Yeah. Well, interesting insight, Alexander. Thanks so much for sharing all your knowledge here on my podcast. Anything else you would like to add? Where can people find out more about you? They have to go to the Duran. It's a big show on YouTube.
Duran, and of course my own channel on YouTube, which is Alexander Mercouris, easy to find. I just want to say again, I think we are closer. The war is at a turning point now. If you follow the war very closely, the situation on the battlefronts is trending more and more to Russia's favor. But they are still interested, I think, in a negotiated solution, because they want to settle in the long term their relations with Europe. Now, if we leave it too long, we might that window of opportunity might close. But we could actually be, if we sought peace now, closer to achieving peace than we have ever been at any time since the conflict began in 2014. We have a choice between peace and war, and that choice remains open, I think, for the rest of the year, but not for much longer. If we leave it too long, then the war will not only continue, but I think the probabilities are, given the direction of events, that the Russians are going to start achieving breakthroughs. And then at that point, it no longer becomes a question of peace. It becomes a question of a Russian military victory, which will perpetuate the underlying conflict in Europe, and which will not be in the interests of any side. So that's what I wanted to say at the end.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Alexander. And hopefully we can do it again maybe next year or so.
Absolutely.